There is one species in Star Wars that has produced some of the most feared warriors in the entire galaxy, and also some of the most loyal Jedi to ever serve the Order. Today we are going all the way back to where it all started, on a planet that shaped every horned face you have ever seen on screen. That planet is called Iridonia. It sits in the mid-rim, tucked away in the Glyth sector, and the people who actually live there describe their own home as tough and unforgiving. This is not a soft, welcoming world. It is dry, it is harsh, and it forces anyone born there to adapt fast just to survive. And that harsh environment is the very thing that shaped the species we are talking about today. The Zabraks. Zabraks are close to human in almost every way, except for a few key differences that set them apart. For starters, they are carnivorous. But the biggest difference is internal. Zabraks have 2 hearts instead of 1. Those 2 hearts pump oxygenated blood faster than a human heart ever could, and that gives Zabraks an edge that most species in the galaxy do not have. They can move faster, they have more stamina, and they can push their bodies physically for far longer stretches than almost anyone else out there. When you see a Zabrak outlast an opponent in a fight, that is not just writing, that is biology. Then there are the horns. Most Zabraks grow a ring of horns around their skull, and these are not decorative. They start developing at puberty, and once a young Zabrak notices them coming in, everyone around them knows what that means. A rite of passage is coming. The horns themselves vary a lot from person to person. Some are short and stubby, some are long and sharp. The placement changes too. No 2 Zabraks look exactly alike when it comes to their horns, and that variation became a part of how individuals were recognized within their own communities. Alongside the horns comes another tradition, and this one might be even more recognizable to fans. Facial tattoos. These are thin ritual lines applied during that same rite of passage, and they carry meaning. Sometimes the tattoos mark which family a Zabrak comes from. Sometimes they point to where that Zabrak was born. And sometimes they are a personal choice, a design the individual wanted for themselves. If you are picturing a very famous Zabrak with black tattoos over red skin right now, you are on the right track. Darth Maul's markings were not just standard Zabrak tradition. They carried specific Sith meaning layered on top of the usual cultural practice, which made his appearance stand out even among his own people. Now here is something a lot of casual fans do not know. Zabraks are not one uniform look across the galaxy. Sources from the Old Republic era describe 2 very different branches of the species, and the split comes down to who influenced them. Zabraks who grew up under Republic influence tended to develop shorter, stumped horns, along with coloring and hair that looked closer to human. Meanwhile, Zabraks who fell under the influence of the Sith Empire developed something much sharper. Their horns grew jagged and pointed, and their skin could range from red to yellow to orange. 2 branches of the same species, shaped by 2 completely different political forces. Personality-wise, Zabraks earned a reputation early on. They are proud. They are self-determined. They do not like relying on anyone outside their own circle. Other species sometimes read that as arrogance. But within Zabrak culture, that pride comes from something else entirely. It comes from surviving. Growing up on a world like Iridonia, in an environment that does not forgive weakness, builds people who take pride in the fact that they made it through. That mindset carried into how Zabraks chose to make a living across the galaxy. They gravitated toward jobs that did not require anyone looking over their shoulder. Independent traders, mercenaries, bounty hunters, scouts, and yes, plenty of Zabraks became Jedi as well. What is remarkable is just how early this species left home. Zabraks were among the first spacefaring peoples in the entire galaxy. Long before the Republic ever made official contact with them, Zabraks had already built colonies far beyond their home system. In Legends continuity, they had established 8 known colonies spread across 5 different systems by the time that first contact happened. Because of this, a lot of Zabraks today identify more with their colony world than with Iridonia itself. Only the ones actually born on the home world get called Iridonian Zabraks. Everyone else traces their roots to wherever their ancestors settled. That early expansion reached further than most people realize. Some Legends researchers who studied ancient species even theorized that the Eloman, a species native to the world Elom, actually descended from early Zabrak colonists. If that theory holds any truth, it shows just how far this species pushed outward and just how early they were doing it compared to almost everyone else in the galaxy. Even the names Zabraks gave themselves reflected where they came from. In Legends, naming conventions were pulled straight from Iridonian wildlife. Families often took surnames from a creature called the Book. Male Zabraks were commonly named after animals known as the Block, the Lock, or the Zur, and female Zabraks frequently took names derived from the trees. Every name was a small connection back to the world that raised them. Long before Darth Maul ever picked up a lightsaber, Iridonia's own ruling council was already doing business with the ancient Sith. They struck deals, hiring elite Iridonian mercenaries for enormous payments. This was the earliest seed of a reputation that would follow Zabraks for thousands of years afterward. The reputation of being some of the most capable hired warriors in the galaxy. And that reputation was backed up by real force sensitivity running through the species. Across nearly every era of galactic history, Zabraks produced Jedi, Sith, and independent dark side users. This was not limited to one time period. It stretched from the ancient Sith Wars all the way through the era of the sequel trilogy. Life on Iridonia itself never made things easy. The planet's ecology included dangerous predators, among them a dog-like creature called the Anuba. Living alongside threats like that built a culture centered on toughness. Clans competed against each other constantly, and martial training was a normal part of growing up long before any Zabrak ever left their home system for the stars. By the time the High Republic era rolled around, Iridonian Zabraks were fully woven into the wider galactic community. But not everyone wanted to stay close to home. Some, like the pirate Saya Keem, chose to leave Iridonia entirely. Keem found the planet's social rules too rigid and went looking for a different life, eventually joining a criminal crew known as the Dank Grax. All of this leads to one important split within the species itself. There are 2 named subspecies of Zabrak, Iridonian Zabraks, who come from the homeworld and its many colonies, and Dathomirian Zabraks, descendants of colonists who settled a very different kind of world, one that would change the direction of this species forever. That world is Dathomir, and that story is where we are headed next. A planet soaked in the dark side, a banished Jedi, and a legacy that would eventually give the galaxy Darth Maul. This is where the story turns strange. Around 600 years before the Battle of Yavin, a Jedi Knight named Alia showed up on a planet called Dathomir. Dathomir was not like other worlds. It carried a deep connection to the dark side of the Force, the kind of place most Jedi would want to stay far away from. The most common version of the story says Alia was exiled there by the Jedi Council. But here is the strange part. The Council itself has no actual record of ever exiling her. So how she really ended up on Dathomir remains something nobody can fully confirm. When Alia arrived, she was not alone on the planet. Other human exiles were already living there, scattered and surviving as best they could. Alia changed everything for them. Using the Force, she tamed the planet's native rancors, massive and dangerous creatures, and she actually rode them. That bond between rider and beast became a defining part of Dathomiri life from that point forward, and it shaped how this entire society would grow over the coming centuries. Alia did not stop at taming rancors. She began teaching the women of Dathomir how to use the Force. That teaching became the foundation of a sect known as the Witches of Dathomir, sometimes called the Daughters of Alia. She also wrote down a set of rules for her followers to live by. This text became known as the Book of Law, a codification of moral and ethical guidance for her people. It ended with a single guiding principle, one that told her followers to never give in to evil. While all of this was happening with Alia and the witches, another group arrived on Dathomir too. Zabrak colonists settled the planet, and over time interbred with the human descendants of Alia's original followers. This created something new, a distinct group known as Dathomirian Zabraks. But the two sexes did not turn out the same. Dathomirian females came out pale-skinned, and they had no horns at all. The males kept the horns and the facial tattoos that defined Zabraks everywhere else in the galaxy. Those Zabrak males eventually earned a name of their own: Night Brothers. As the generations passed, Alia's descendants did not stay unified. They split apart into competing clans, each one led by women, and each one interpreting the Book of Law a little differently than the last. Two of the more notable groups to form were the Singing Mountain Clan and the Blue Coral Divers Clan. Different clans, different interpretations, but all tracing back to the same origin. Then came a darker split, one that would define Dathomir far more than any of the earlier clan divisions. Two sisters, Gethzerion and Baritha, attempted to assassinate a clan leader named Ogwyn Jo. The attempt failed. As punishment, both sisters were exiled from their clan. Instead of fading away, they banded together with other exiles and built something new. They began practicing what became known as night spells, forbidden techniques that broke away entirely from the teachings in the Book of Law. They wrote their own text to govern this new path, calling it the Book of Shadows. This splinter group became known as the Nightsisters. The power the Nightsisters wielded had a name: magic. It was drawn from a mystical substance called ichor that flowed somewhere beneath the surface of Dathomir itself. The most skilled among the Nightsisters could do things that seemed almost impossible. They could conjure objects out of nothing. They could change their own appearance at will. And when a sister passed away, the surviving witches performed elaborate rituals in her honor, wrapping the body in cloth soaked in magic and hanging the burial pod from the twisted branches of what were called grave thorn trees. While the Nightsisters practiced their magic and ruled their society, the Night Brother males lived a completely separate existence. They were kept apart from the witches entirely, treated as a warrior caste meant for combat and physical labor. They had no access to magic. They had no voice in how Dathomir was governed. This rigid divide between the powerful witches and the subservient warrior males became the exact world that Maul and his brother Savage Opress would later be born into. Around 31 BBY, one ambitious clan mother named Zalem tried something drastic. Dathomir held an ancient structure built by a species called the Qua, known as the Infinity Gate. Zalem attempted to activate it with the goal of destroying Coruscant itself. It did not work out for her. The plot was uncovered and stopped before it could succeed, and Zalem lost her life in the process, killed by her own daughter Roslai, with help from a Jedi Knight named Dryden Vos. Zalem's defeat left a power vacuum on Dathomir, and that vacuum did not stay empty for long. A shaman known as Mother Talzin stepped into it. Where the clans had been scattered and constantly fighting among themselves for generations, Talzin finally managed to bring them together under one coven. This moment marked the beginning of her rise, and she would go on to become the most powerful and consequential Nightsister leader in recorded history. There is one more layer to this story that complicates everything we just covered. Material introduced in the show, Ahsoka, suggests the true origin of the Dathomiri people might reach back even further than Alia's arrival. According to this canon material, the roots may trace all the way to a world outside our own galaxy called Peridea. There, an ancient witch kingdom ruled by mysterious figures known as the Great Mothers may have existed long before Alia ever set foot on Dathomir. This does not erase the Alia legend, but it does suggest there is more to the story than the commonly told version. There is also an earlier conflict worth mentioning, described in legends and other supplementary sources. Invaders called the Fromprath tried to seize control of Dathomir's resources at some point in its history. The native witches fought back and successfully repelled the invasion. And in doing so, they captured alien technology from the Fromprath, which they later adapted into their own signature weapons, energy bows that became closely tied to Nightsister identity from that point forward. By the time the rest of the galaxy even became aware that Dathomir existed, the Nightsisters and their Night Brothers were already a fully formed society, closed off and self-sufficient. They had their own government, their own beliefs, and their own way of life, built entirely apart from the wider Star Wars galaxy. That isolation held for a very long time. It would take a Sith Lord searching for a new weapon to finally pull Dathomir into the events that would shape the rest of the galaxy. Long before anyone had ever heard the name Zabrak connected to the Sith in the way most fans know it today, this species was already fighting Sith wars for money. Thousands of years worth of them. Iridonia's ruling High Council struck up a business relationship with the ancient Sith that stretched back further than almost anyone in the galaxy realized. They hired out elite Iridonian mercenaries for enormous payments, turning war into a trade the same way other species traded spice or starships. This arrangement went on for so long that by the time the Clone Wars rolled around, most historians assumed the ancient Sith were gone, a story from the deep past with no bearing on the present. But the fighting culture that grew out of those old contracts never left. It became a permanent part of who the Zabraks were as a people, long after the Sith who paid for it had faded from memory. The first major conflict to pull Zabraks into galactic history on a large scale came around 5000 BBY. This was the Great Hyperspace War. It started after the Republic stumbled onto the Sith homeworld of Korriban entirely by accident. That discovery triggered an invasion led by a Sith Lord named Naga Sadow, and the fighting that followed dragged in mercenary forces from across the galaxy. Iridonian mercenary bands were already active players in conflicts of that era, and this war was no exception. They fought on both sides of the divide, hired guns caught in the middle of an ancient struggle between the Republic and the Sith. Roughly 1,000 years later, between about 4,400 and 3,986 BBY, an even larger conflict took shape. It began with the fall of a Jedi named Freeden Nad, whose corruption spread into the royal family of Onderon. That corruption eventually helped spark the Great Sith War, fought by Exar Kun and Ulic Qel-Droma against the Republic. As that war expanded, it swallowed up countless independent mercenary companies across the galaxy. Zabrak sellswords were right in the middle of it, pulled in by Sith gold on one side and Mandalorian contracts on the other. Loyalty was never really the point for these fighters. The paycheck was. By 3681 BBY, during the Great Galactic War, one Zabrak stood out from the rest for reasons that had nothing to do with money. His name was Khao Chen Darach, a Jedi Master known as a legendary battle master. He had trained a young Padawan named Satil Shun, someone who would go on to play a major role in Republic history. When the long-vanished Sith Empire suddenly reappeared and threatened Korriban, Khao Chen Darach stood his ground, defending the approaches to that world. He fought against Sith Lord Vindicun and his apprentice Darth Malgus, and in doing so, he bought Satil Shun the time she needed to escape and warn the Republic that the Sith Empire was back. His sacrifice became one of the defining Zabrak contributions to that entire war. The Great Galactic War left a permanent mark on where Zabraks actually lived. Surviving colonies ended up split geographically, some falling under Republic control and others under Sith Empire control. This physical separation deepened a cultural divide that had already been building for generations, the same split between the two visually distinct branches of the species covered earlier in this story. Zabraks under Republic influence continued down one path. Zabraks under Sith Empire influence continued down another. Neither side was going anywhere near the other anytime soon. This entire era is also where the intense, almost ritual-style martial training that Zabraks became known for really took hold. Between their two hearts and their unusually high tolerance for pain, Zabraks made excellent soldiers no matter which banner they were fighting under. Republic commanders wanted them. Sith commanders wanted them just as badly. That demand pushed Zabrak culture even further into a mindset built around combat readiness and physical endurance. Even where Zabrak colonies were built reflected this restless, combat-heavy existence. Many colonies were deliberately founded along major hyperspace lanes. This kept the species connected to the wider galaxy and fed their natural drive to explore. But it also guaranteed something else: regular contact with both Republic and Sith fleets passing through those same lanes. And regular contact in a galaxy at war almost always meant regular conflict. Years later, Star Wars: The Old Republic confirmed just how far this flexibility went. Zabraks were shown to be eligible for practically every major role available during this era of galactic history. They could become Jedi Knights or Jedi Consulars on one end of the spectrum. They could just as easily become Sith Inquisitors or Sith Warriors on the other. Beyond the Force, using classes, Zabraks also worked as bounty hunters, smugglers, troopers, and Imperial agents. There was no single path that defined the species. That range stands as clear proof that Zabrak loyalty was never locked to one faction, one government, or one side of the Force. This pattern, fighting for pay, switching sides when the money or the mission called for it, and never fully committing to Republic or Sith, set a precedent that would echo across the next 4,000 years of galactic history. It would take a very long time, but eventually another Sith Lord would come looking for Force-sensitive Zabrak recruits all over again. Only this time, he would not be looking on Iridonia. He would be looking on the colony world of Dathomir, where an entirely different kind of Zabrak society had been quietly growing in the shadows. Not every Zabrak who shaped galactic history did it with a weapon in hand. Some did it with a mind built for engineering, and one of them ended up carrying more guilt than almost anyone else in this entire story. His name was Bao-Dur. During the Mandalorian Wars, which raged from around 3964 to 3960 BBY, Bao-Dur served the Galactic Republic as a soldier and an engineer. He served first under the command of a Jedi general named Revan, one of the most famous military leaders of that entire conflict. Bao-Dur represented a different side of Zabrak culture than most people expect. Instead of leaning on the species' reputation as fierce warriors, he leaned on skill, precision, and technical talent. He built things, and what he built would end up changing the course of the entire war. That creation was called the Mass Shadow Generator. It was a mass driver superweapon, and its purpose was almost impossible to fully grasp. It could collapse the gravity well of an entire planet. Any fleet caught within its radius when it activated would be torn apart by the sheer gravitational force. This was not a bomb. This was something closer to bending the laws of physics into a weapon. The moment that weapon was truly put to the test came at the Battle of Malachor V in 3960 BBY. Republic forces deployed the Mass Shadow Generator directly against the Mandalorian fleet stationed there. It worked. The device effectively ended the Mandalorian Wars in a single, catastrophic strike. But the cost of that victory was staggering. The blast radius did not distinguish between friend and enemy. Much of the Republic fleet caught in the same area was torn apart right alongside the Mandalorian ships they were fighting. Bao-Dur himself was caught in the devastation and lost his right arm in the process. The physical wound healed eventually. The weight of what happened at Malachor V did not. Bao-Dur carried deep guilt for years afterward. He had built the very weapon responsible for wiping out countless Republic soldiers alongside the Mandalorian forces it was meant to stop. That is not an easy thing to live with, knowing your own hands built something capable of that much damage, and knowing your own side paid nearly as steep a price as the enemy did. In the years following Malachor V, Bao-Dur found a new purpose. He began serving a mysterious figure known as the Jedi Exile, a former general under Revan who had been stripped of her Jedi rank. Around 3951 BBY, Bao-Dur joined her on a journey that spanned the galaxy, searching for the Jedi Order's lost masters. He brought two things with him on that journey: a remote combat droid of his own design, built specifically to fight alongside him, and a modified prosthetic arm, replacing the one he had lost at Malachor V. Even in how he adapted to his own injury, Bao-Dur's engineering mind never stopped working. What makes Bao-Dur stand out is just how deeply his story gets explored. Across all of Legends, few individual Zabraks receive the kind of psychological depth that his arc carries. He is a being racked by guilt over mass devastation, yet still driven by loyalty and by a genuine determination to make things right through continued service. He is not a warrior chasing glory. He is someone trying to make amends for something he can never fully undo. After the exile eventually departed known space, Bao-Dur's story suggests he stayed behind and helped rebuild the shattered Jedi Order in the years following the Jedi Civil War. He took the same engineering talent that once built a weapon capable of wiping out fleets, and he pointed it toward reconstruction instead. While all of this was happening with Bao-Dur individually, the Zabrak clans back on Iridonia stayed almost entirely out of it. During both the Mandalorian Wars and the Jedi Civil War that followed, Iridonia largely maintained neutrality as a homeworld. This fits a pattern that had already been building for generations. Zabraks tended to serve as individuals, choosing their own paths and their own causes, rather than mobilizing as one unified homeworld behind a single banner. This same pattern would show up again generations later, during the Clone Wars and again under the Empire. There is one more piece of this story worth sitting with. The name Malachor V would not stay buried in the past. Thousands of years later, another Zabrak would find himself stranded on an eerily similar world, one known as Malachor. That world already carried a name tied to catastrophic weaponry and to Zabrak sacrifice long before this later Zabrak ever set foot there. History has a strange way of circling back, and for this species, Malachor became one of its clearest examples. Every villain has a beginning most people never see. For Darth Maul, that beginning starts with a mother's decision, made years before anyone knew his name. Around 54 BBY, a Nightsister named Kaisina made a choice that would ripple across the rest of galactic history. She had a newborn son, and she did not want him growing up as a common night brother, stuck in the same subservient warrior role that defined so many Zabrak males on Dathomir. So she went to Darth Sidious and asked him to take the child away. Sidious sensed something extraordinary in the infant, an unusual amount of force potential, and he agreed. That single decision set the chain of events in motion that would eventually produce Darth Maul, a story this series covers in full detail next. A few years later, around 50 BBY, a different Nightsister clan made a decision of their own. This clan was struggling, and to secure continued protection, they gave up a young initiate named Asajj Ventress to a Sinitine criminal named Halstead. At the time, nobody could have known what that trade would eventually mean. Ventress would go on to become one of the most famous Nightsisters in galactic history, but her path there began with her own people handing her away. The bigger turning point for Dathomir as a whole came around 31 BBY. A clan mother named Zalem, who had tried to seize far more power than any single leader should hold, was finally defeated. In the aftermath of her fall, a shaman known as Mother Talzin stepped forward. Dathomir's clans had been scattered and feuding for generations, but Talzin succeeded where no one else had. She bound them together into a single unified Nightsister Coven. Talzin did not stop at unification. She pushed the Nightsisters in a direction the Coven had not gone in generations. Instead of staying closed off and isolated, she turned her people into interstellar mercenaries, selling combat-trained witches and Night Brother muscle to wealthy clients scattered across the galaxy. The Nightsisters were no longer just a self-contained society on a forgotten world. They were now a resource other people could hire. All the while, Talzin and Sidious kept building on the connection that had started with Kitina's son years earlier. Their relationship became an uneasy, transactional alliance. Each side shared dark side secrets with the other, blending Nightsister magic with Sith philosophy in a way that had rarely, if ever, happened before in galactic history. But Talzin understood exactly how fragile this partnership really was. The Sith operated under a strict rule of two, one master and one apprentice, nothing more. That meant Sidious could never fully accept a rival power base like a unified Nightsister Coven, existing permanently alongside his own Sith Order. Talzin's caution turned out to be justified. Sidious eventually betrayed the alliance outright. He took Talzin's own son from her, the same child she had allowed him to raise years earlier, and claimed him fully as his Sith apprentice. It was an act of manipulation and theft, and Talzin would spend decades quietly plotting to avenge it. Even as all of this unfolded, Dathomir did not become a single unified front. Other independent witch clans, including the Singing Mountain clan and the Blue Coral Divers clan, continued operating alongside Talzin's coven throughout this period. They preserved their own separate traditions, even as Talzin's personal influence continued to grow across the planet. By the time the Clone Wars were about to begin, every major piece of the coming tragedy was already sitting in place. A Sith Lord was secretly raising a Zabrak weapon in isolation. A Nightsister matriarch was nursing a grudge that had been simmering for years. And an entire population of hardened Dathomirian warriors was about to be pulled into the bloodiest war the galaxy had seen in 1,000 years. Somewhere on Dathomir, a mother handed over her newborn son, believing she was saving him from a life of servitude. What she actually did was hand the galaxy its most feared Sith weapon in 1,000 years. Maul was born on Dathomir in 54 BBY to the Nightsister Kisina. He was one of 3 brothers alongside Savage Opress and Feral. And like every Zabrak male born into that society, the boys were initially raised among the Night Brother tribes, serving under the ruling Nightsisters. That was supposed to be Maul's entire future, a life of labor and combat, with no voice and no power of his own. That future changed the moment Darth Sidious sensed something in the infant that went far beyond ordinary Force potential. Sidious took Maul off Dathomir entirely and began shaping him into his first true Sith apprentice. The training that followed was merciless by design. Sidious wanted every trace of hesitation stripped out of the boy, every flicker of weakness, every emotion that had not been deliberately earned through discipline and pain. Nothing soft was allowed to survive that process. By the time Maul turned around 14 years old, Sidious formally accepted him as his apprentice. The years that followed finished the job. Maul grew into an acrobatic, ferocious warrior, trained to fight with a signature weapon unlike anything the Jedi had seen in generations. A double-bladed red lightsaber that turned him into a blur in combat. In 32 BBY, Sidious finally sent Maul out on his first true mission. He dispatched him to enforce the Trade Federation's blockade treaty during the invasion of Naboo. This was not just another assignment. It marked the Sith Order's first confirmed reappearance in 1,000 years, a return nobody in the galaxy was prepared for, since most of the Jedi genuinely believed the Sith had gone extinct generations earlier. Maul tracked Queen Padme Amidala's escaping starship all the way to Tatooine. There, he briefly clashed with Jedi Master Qui-Gon Jinn. Jinn survived that first encounter and rushed to warn the Jedi Council that the Sith had returned. The Council did not take the warning seriously at first. Deep skepticism met a claim that should have sent alarms through the entire Order. The real confrontation came on Naboo, inside the Theed Generator Complex. Maul dueled both Qui-Gon Jinn and his Padawan, Obi-Wan Kenobi, at the same time. It was a brutal, fast-moving fight, and Maul eventually drove his blade through Qui-Gon's torso, a wound Qui-Gon would not recover from. What happened next became one of the most replayed moments in the franchise's entire history. Obi-Wan, driven by rage and grief, used a Force-boosted leap and Qui-Gon's own lightsaber to cut Maul clean in half at the waist. Both halves of Maul's body fell down a reactor shaft, and the entire galaxy assumed that was the end of him. For over a decade, that belief held. Maul's apparent defeat on Naboo became one of the single most iconic moments in all of Star Wars, and the galaxy, including the Jedi Order itself, moved on completely convinced the mysterious horned Sith assassin was gone for good. Nobody knew the truth. Down in the depths below Theed Palace, Maul's own hatred for Obi-Wan Kenobi kept him alive when nothing else should have. That hatred alone carried him through the years that followed, broken, mutilated, and slowly losing his grip on sanity. Eventually, he made his way to a distant junk world that would later be identified as Lotho Minor, a planet as forgotten and discarded as Maul himself had become. "12 years is a long time to hold on to rage. For Maul, it was long enough to lose almost everything that made him human, and just barely enough to bring him back. For over a decade following his fall on Naboo, Maul survived on the junk world Lotho Minor. He was barely more than a scavenging creature at that point, half insane from pain and hatred, dragging himself around on crude mechanical spider legs he had built from salvaged wreckage. Nobody in the galaxy knew he was still out there. Nobody was looking for him either. Nobody except one person. Mother Talzin never gave up on her son. While she spent those same years consolidating Nightsister power during the opening stretch of the Clone Wars, she quietly tracked rumors drifting in from the Outer Rim about a mad Zabrak living among the junk heaps. She never stopped listening for word of him. Around this same period, Count Dooku came to Dathomir looking for something new. He had lost faith in Asajj Ventress, who had grown far too independent for his liking, and he wanted a fresh Sith assassin to take her place. Talzin staged a brutal gladiatorial trial known as the Selection, pitting the planet's Night Brother warriors against each other to find a worthy champion. Savage Opress won that trial through sheer ferocity, but winning was not enough on its own. As final proof of his loyalty, he was ordered to end the life of his own brother Ferrell, who had also competed in the Selection. Under the influence of the Nightsisters' mind control magic, Opress complied, using his own hands to carry out the order against his brother. It was a brutal price for power, and it would not be the last time loyalty cost Opress everything he had. Nightsister sorcery did not stop there. It physically reshaped Opress, enlarging his muscles and granting him strength far beyond a normal Zabrak. Once the transformation was complete, he was handed over to Count Dooku on Sereno, where he began serving as a separatist dark acolyte, a secret weapon meant to be used against the Jedi Order. What Dooku did not know was that Asajj Ventress had already gotten to Opress first. She secretly recruited him as her own agent, hoping to use him to strike back at Dooku in revenge for her own earlier betrayal and dismissal from Sith service. The two of them made an attempt on Dooku's life together, and it failed. When Ventress turned on Opress afterward, berating him for the failure, something in him snapped. His rage boiled over, and he turned on both of them at once, attacking Ventress and Dooku indiscriminately and severing his ties to both of his supposed masters in a single violent outburst. Opress returned to Dathomir in disgrace. But there, Mother Talzin gave him something worth more than any selection trial ever could. She told him his brother Maul was still alive. Opress set out across the galaxy on a personal search, following every lead until he finally tracked Maul down on the same junk planet where he had spent 12 years wasting away. What Opress found was barely recognizable. Maul was mentally shattered, barely coherent, and clinging to life more out of habit than purpose. Still, Opress convinced him to return to Dathomir. There, Mother Talzin performed a powerful restorative ritual on her lost son. She repaired his fractured mind piece by piece, and she replaced his makeshift spider legs with functional cybernetic prosthetics built from parts salvaged off destroyer droids. Maul came out of that ritual a different being, coherent, focused, and armed with the single purpose that had somehow kept him alive through 12 years of madness. Revenge against Obi-Wan Kenobi, the Jedi who had cut him down on Naboo all those years earlier. Out of everything Maul went through, the bond he formed with Savage Opress stands apart. It was one of the only genuine moments of loyalty in his entire ruthless life, and unlike nearly every other relationship Maul ever had, this one was not built on coercion or control. Savage chose it freely. That same bond would resurface 15 years later when Maul went searching for a new apprentice during the events of Shadow Lord. Maul was no longer the broken creature from Lotho Minor. He was whole again, focused again, and this time he was not coming back alone. With Savage Opress at his side as his own apprentice, Maul launched a campaign of terror across the Outer Rim. Every move was deliberate. He wanted to leave a trail of destruction impossible to ignore, one designed specifically to draw Obi-Wan Kenobi out for one final confrontation. To make that happen, Maul and Savage built something the underworld had never seen before. They called it the Shadow Collective, a criminal super syndicate that pulled together the Pike Syndicate, Black Sun, the Hutt clan, and a splinter faction of Mandalorian warriors known as Death Watch. Rival factions that had spent years working against each other suddenly found themselves united under a single banner, forced together by Maul's ambition. Nobody could remember the underworld ever being unified like that before. Maul took control of Death Watch the same way he took control of everything else. He challenged its leader, Pre Vizsla, to a duel, and it was over almost as soon as it began. Maul struck him down in a brutal one-sided fight and walked away with command of the Mandalorian warriors along with Vizsla's legendary weapon, the Darksaber. With Death Watch's forces now fully under his command, Maul set his sights on Mandalore itself. he orchestrated a hostile takeover of a world that was officially neutral, and the planet fell straight into civil war. Maul's Shadow Collective loyalists fought against the opposing Mandalorian faction, led by Bo-Katan Kryze, and the fighting tore Mandalore apart from the inside. When Obi-Wan Kenobi finally arrived to investigate what was happening, Maul was ready for him. He captured Obi-Wan and forced him to watch as he ended the life of Duchess Satine Kryze, the woman Obi-Wan loved. It was a calculated, deliberate act of cruelty, designed to make Obi-Wan feel a fraction of the agony Maul himself had carried for over a decade. Obi-Wan was eventually freed by a rival faction within Death Watch and managed to escape Mandalore, right as Maul's grip on the planet's underworld empire reached its most violent peak. But Maul's rise had not gone unnoticed. His takeover of Mandalore and his rapidly expanding criminal empire sent ripples through the dark side, strong enough for Darth Sidious himself to detect them from a distance. Sidious traveled to Mandalore personally to confront his former apprentice. Under the Sith's rule of two, there was no room for two powerful Zabrak brothers building an empire of their own. Sidious viewed them as an unacceptable rival power, plain and simple. The confrontation that followed was one-sided in the worst way. Sidious struck down Savage Opress in a single move, without hesitation. He then turned his full attention to Maul, overpowering him despite Maul fighting back with everything he had out of sheer desperation. Sidious eventually disarmed him and tortured him with Force lightning, leaving him broken on the ground. And yet Sidious did not finish him. He coldly informed Maul that he was no longer his apprentice, but that he still saw further use for him down the line. Instead of ending things there, Sidious took Maul into captivity. Maul did not stay a prisoner for long. Loyalist Mandalorian forces eventually rescued him, and he immediately went to work trying to rebuild what remained of his shattered Shadow Collective. Around this same time, he found himself manipulating events between Count Dooku and General Grievous, a chapter of his story told in full through the Son of Dathomir comics. It was during this same period that Mother Talzin made her final act. Facing Sidious's ongoing schemes against her son, she sacrificed herself to protect him, channeling the last of her power through Maul as a conduit before her life came to an end. It was the final act of a mother who had spent decades fighting for her son in every way she could, and it severed Maul's last living connection to Dathomir and to the Coven that had once been his mother's entire world. By the time this chapter of his story closed, Maul had lost almost everything. His brother was gone. His mother was gone. His Mandalorian empire had crumbled, and even the Darksaber had slipped out of his hands. He entered the final year of the Clone Wars with nothing left to hold on to except his own hatred and the dark side of the Force that had shaped him since he was an infant. While Maul was tearing across the galaxy, leaving devastation in his wake, two other Zabraks were sitting in the most respected room in the entire Jedi Order. Their names were Eeth Koth and Agen Kolar, and their story proves this species was never destined for darkness alone. Eeth Koth broke the mold from the very start. He was an Iridonian Zabrak, but unlike most Jedi, he was not born on one of the traditional Cradle worlds the Order usually recruited from. Koth was born on Nar Shaddaa instead, and he was recruited unusually late in life compared to most Padawans. None of that stopped him. He rose through the ranks to become one of the most respected masters the Order had. Koth earned a seat on the Jedi High Council before the invasion of Naboo in 32 BBY. and he held that seat through the outbreak of the Clone Wars. He fought at the First Battle of Geonosis in 22 BBY, standing alongside Mace Windu's strike team in one of the opening confrontations of the entire war. Later in the war, Koth found himself captured by General Grievous and imprisoned aboard an enemy vessel. He did not wait to be found. Using sign language hidden inside a routine holotransmission, he quietly signaled his location to the Jedi without his captors realizing what he was doing. That message reached the right people, and a rescue mission led by Obi-Wan Kenobi, Anakin Skywalker, and Adi Gallia brought him home. As the war entered its final stretch, Koth was removed from the Jedi Council. He was replaced by a fellow Zabrak, Agen Kolar. Rather than fight the decision, Koth left the Jedi Order entirely. He married a fellow Zabrak named Mira and became a priest within the Church of the Ganthic Enlightenment, trading his lightsaber for a completely different kind of life. Agen Kolar, also an Iridonian Zabrak Jedi Master, stepped into the council seat Koth left behind, right as the war was reaching its darkest turn. In 19 BBY, Kolar stood in the Chancellor's office on Coruscant when Mace Windu led a team of council members to arrest Darth Sidious for treason. That confrontation ended almost as soon as it started. Kolar was the first Jedi struck down, hit instantly by Sidious's blade before Windu even had a chance to intervene. He became one of the earliest and most prominent Jedi lost in the Order's final collapse. Eeth Koth, meanwhile, was still alive when Order 66 swept across the galaxy, and the fact that he had already left the Jedi Order is likely what allowed him to survive it. But that safety did not last. Years later, Darth Vader and the Inquisitorius tracked him down, and the timing could not have been crueler. He had only just welcomed a child with Mira. The Empire was hunting down Force sensitives across the galaxy by then, and Koth was exactly the kind of target they were looking for. Koth tried to reason his way out of it. He told Vader he was no longer a threat, that he had not practiced as a Jedi in years. Vader did not listen. He forced Koth into a lightsaber duel that ended Koth's life around 14 BBY. His infant child was taken afterward and handed over to the Grand Inquisitor, part of an Imperial program known as Project Harvester, built specifically to seize Force-sensitive children. Koth and Kolar never crossed paths with Maul directly in this part of the story, but their fates say everything about what this species was truly capable of. One Zabrak fell in a doomed last stand against the Sith he had sworn to fight. The other spent years trying to walk away from that fight entirely, only to be hunted down regardless. Together, their stories stand as a direct counterpoint to everything Maul and Savage represented. Zabrak destiny was never fixed to one side of the Force. It never had been. Maul wanted one final shot at revenge. What he got instead was a war-ending betrayal that would send him running for his life, alone, for the very first time. In the closing days of the Clone Wars, Maul returned to Mandalore with a plan built entirely around Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi. He wanted to lure them both into a trap. If he could capture Anakin, or better yet, turn him, he believed he could rob Darth Sidious of his prized future apprentice and finally claim the revenge he had been chasing since Naboo. But Kenobi and Skywalker never showed up. Both of them had been pulled away to rescue a kidnapped Chancellor Palpatine on Coruscant, leaving Maul with a very different opponent standing in front of him instead. Former Jedi Padawan Ahsoka Tano arrived at the Siege of Mandalore, leading a Republic clone legion under the newly promoted Commander Rex. Maul's Shadow Collective forces did not go down without a fight. They led Ahsoka and her troops into a deadly trap through Mandalore's undercity, and several clones lost their lives in the process, including clone Captain Vaughn. It was only after that brutal ambush that Maul and Ahsoka finally stood face to face. Maul recognized something familiar in her right away. Here was another outcast, someone rejected by her own order the same way he had once been shaped and discarded by his. He offered her an alliance against the growing darkness of the Sith. Ahsoka refused. Instead, she chose to fight him herself, and what followed is remembered today as one of the finest lightsaber duels in the history of Star Wars animation. Ahsoka won. She turned Maul's own blade against him and took him into Republic custody, restrained with a force-suppressing Mandalorian device. He was set to be transported to the Jedi Council aboard a Venator-class Star Destroyer named the Tribunal, where he would finally face trial for everything he had done. He never made it there. Before Maul could reach Coruscant, Darth Sidious activated Order 66 across the entire galaxy at the exact same moment. Hidden biochips inside every clone trooper triggered simultaneously, and in an instant, soldiers who had fought alongside the Jedi for years turned against them without warning. Aboard the Tribunal, the clone troopers turned on Ahsoka along with everyone else. In the chaos, she made a desperate call. She freed Maul from his restraints, not out of trust, but because she needed a violent distraction to buy herself and Rex enough time to escape the doomed ship. Maul did exactly what Ahsoka hoped he would, and then some. He tore through the Star Destroyer, and in the process he accidentally destroyed its hyperdrive, sending the entire ship crashing onto a nearby moon. But loyalty was never part of the deal. Maul betrayed Ahsoka's gamble completely, stealing her personal shuttle and fleeing into hyperspace alone, free of Sidious's grip for the first time in his entire life. That escape marked Maul's final appearance during the Clone Wars itself. He vanished into the unknown with his criminal empire in ruins and his family gone, leaving behind a mystery that would not be answered again until the earliest years of the newly formed Galactic Empire. Maul vanished after the fall of the Republic, but his story did not end there. It picked back up on a planet called Janix, in the earliest years of the newly formed Galactic Empire. Cast aside and hunted ever since the Republic collapsed, Maul made his way to Janix, a gritty, crime-ridden world that had largely slipped past direct Imperial control. His goal was simple: rebuild the Shadow Collective from nothing, starting on a planet far enough from the Empire's reach to give him room to work. On Janix, Maul crossed paths with Devon Izara, a disillusioned young Twi'lek and former Jedi Padawan still running from the fallout of Order 66. Maul saw potential in her almost immediately. To him, she looked like a chance to replace everything he lost when Savage Opress was taken from him. Devon was not without protection. Her Jedi master, Ako Diodaki, had survived Order 66 himself, and he had spent the years since determined to shield his Padawan from two threats at once: the Empire's Inquisitors on one side and Maul's manipulative influence on the other. Maul also found himself butting heads with Captain Branda Lawson, a principled police detective digging into Janix's criminal underworld. Lawson worked alongside his droid partner Two Boots and his son Riley Lawson, and Riley's growing bond with Devon only made Maul's plans harder to pull off cleanly. Imperial Inquisitors. Marok and the 11th brother hunted the entire group on Sidious's orders, and the danger kept climbing until Maul's past finally caught up with him in the worst possible way. The Empire's forces hunting them turned out to include Darth Vader himself. The duel that followed was not close. Vader overwhelmed Maul, Daki, and Devon all at once, at one point lifting Maul off the ground in a crushing telekinetic grip. It was the clash between two of Darth Sidious's most famous apprentices, and it proved devastatingly one-sided in Vader's favor. Master Daki tried to buy his allies time, standing against Vader so the others could escape. But Maul, already thinking only of his own survival, used the Force to shove Daki directly into Vader's path. It was a betrayal that sealed the Jedi Master's fate, and Maul did it purely to secure Devon's loyalty for himself. Watching her master fall changed everything for Devon. Consumed by grief and rage, she finally gave in to the dark side, accepting half of Maul's own lightsaber and agreeing to become his Sith apprentice. It was the same pattern Maul had followed his entire life, turning someone else's loss into loyalty toward him. This chapter of Maul's story also planted the seeds for what came next. It quietly set up his future alliance with crime lord Dryden Vos and the Syndicate Crimson Dawn, the same alliance that would eventually lead to Maul's brief but unforgettable appearance years later in the story of the smuggler Han Solo. There is something bigger sitting underneath all of this, too. Maul's path on Janix finally brought to life an idea George Lucas had once imagined for a possible future era of the saga, one where Maul becomes a galaxy-spanning crime boss, commanding a Twi'lek apprentice at his side. Fans had speculated for years that a Twi'lek apprentice like this was meant to eventually become the Legends character Darth Talon, and this new chapter folded that concept directly into official canon. Devon's fall to the dark side did not close the book on Maul's story either. It only opened the next one, setting up a looming rematch against the Inquisitorius and Darth Vader that was still waiting to unfold. While Maul was busy manipulating a broken Padawan on Janix, the rest of his species was fighting for its survival across the galaxy. The Empire had no interest in letting the Zabraks keep the independence they had spent thousands of years building. Zabrak home and colony worlds fell under heavy military garrisons almost as soon as the Empire took shape. Local industrial infrastructure was systematically torn down, and crushing taxation drained what little economic freedom these worlds had left. None of it was random. It was designed specifically to strip a naturally independent species of its economic and political autonomy piece by piece. The Zabraks did not accept it. This was a species built on pride and self-determination, and that reputation was not just talk. Across multiple worlds, Zabraks mounted sustained resistance against Imperial occupation, refusing to bow to the New Order's authority even while staring down a military force they had almost no realistic chance of matching. Many individual Zabraks, who might have otherwise stayed out of galactic politics entirely, found themselves pulled into open rebellion during this period. Some of them ended up joining the earliest rebel cells, the same scattered groups that would eventually grow into the Alliance to restore the Republic. While that resistance was building across Zabrak colonies, Maul was doing what he always did, surviving and rebuilding. Having lived through his encounter with Vader on Janix, he continued operating from the shadows in the years that followed, keeping Devon Izara close as his apprentice while quietly consolidating influence over the crime syndicate Crimson Dawn alongside crime lord Dryden Vos. In 13 BBY, Maul finally let the wider galaxy catch a glimpse of what he had built. During the events later tied to the story of the smuggler Han Solo, Maul appeared in a brief but unmistakable holographic message to a young operative named Kira. He revealed himself as Crimson Dawn's true master and ignited his own double-bladed lightsaber, confirming something the galaxy had refused to believe for over a decade. The Sith Lord everyone assumed was gone was still very much alive, and still one of the most dangerous figures in the underworld. By roughly 10 BBY, that power had solidified completely. Maul had become the true hidden authority behind Crimson Dawn, ruling from an underworld headquarters while lieutenants like Vos handled the Syndicate's public dealings out across the Outer Rim. Maul stayed out of sight, but nothing moved through Crimson Dawn without his approval. Maul was far from the only Zabrak carving out a place in this new criminal landscape. Throughout the entire age of the Empire, Zabrak bounty hunters, mercenaries, and independent operators kept showing up across the underworld and along the fringes of Imperial space. This was nothing new for the species. It was the same historic preference for work that required minimal outside supervision, the same pattern that had defined Zabrak culture since the earliest days on Iridonia. Back on Iridonia itself, and across the other Zabrak colony worlds, the old traditions never disappeared either. Martial discipline and clan-based tattoo rites continued underground, even as Imperial administrators worked hard to stamp out any open display of Zabrak independence. You cannot erase thousands of years of culture with a garrison and a tax code, and the Zabraks proved that every single day they held on to their traditions in secret. By the time this period of galactic history came to a close, one thing about the Zabraks had been proven beyond any doubt. This was a species that refused to bow quietly to any single authority. Whether that authority wore Sith black, ran a criminal empire, or governed in the Emperor's name. Whether the pressure came from Darth Sidious, from Maul himself, or from the Empire's own iron grip, the Zabraks kept finding a way to hold on to who they were. The hidden master of Crimson Dawn did not stay hidden forever. Years after that holographic message to Kira, Maul's long game finally started catching up with him, and it would lead him straight back to where his entire story began. By the time we reached the era of Star Wars Rebels, Maul was aging, increasingly desperate, and stranded on the ancient Sith world of Malachor. The name alone carried weight for this species, echoing the same mass shadow generator catastrophe from the Mandalorian Wars centuries earlier. Maul ended up there after crash landing while being pursued by an Imperial Inquisitor known as the Eighth Brother, a hunt that left him grounded on a planet already soaked in Zabrak history. It was on Malachor that Maul crossed paths with a young rebel Jedi apprentice named Ezra Bridger. He saw an opportunity immediately. Here was another impressionable teenager, and Maul went to work trying to manipulate him into becoming his new Sith apprentice. One more attempt to replace everything he had lost over the decades. Maul guided Ezra and his master, Kanan Jarrus, deep into an ancient Sith temple on Malachor. Before it was over, several Inquisitors fell in the encounter, and Maul permanently blinded Kanan Jarrus with a vicious lightsaber strike. He escaped the planet afterward in the Eighth Brother's stolen TIE fighter, leaving devastation behind him just like he always had. His attempt to turn Ezra ultimately failed, but Maul still walked away with something valuable: Using the combined power of a Jedi holocron and a Sith holocron together, he pulled crucial information out of the boy, information that pointed him toward the long-hidden location of his true arch-enemy. Obi-Wan Kenobi, living in exile on Tatooine. Maul tracked Ezra's movements to Tatooine next, hoping the boy would lead him straight to Kenobi. The plan worked exactly as intended. Ezra's presence on the planet drew Kenobi out of hiding to protect him, setting up the final encounter between Maul and the man who had shaped the course of his entire life. Maul figured out quickly that Kenobi was not just hiding out on Tatooine. He was protecting someone important, someone the Empire could not be allowed to find. Maul understood immediately just how dangerous that information could become if it ever reached Imperial hands. The duel that followed was over in seconds. Obi-Wan ignited his lightsaber and ended it almost instantly, using a technique that echoed Qui-Gon Jinn's own dueling style from decades earlier. It was a fitting echo of the very duel that had first defined Maul's entire existence, closing the circle that opened on Naboo all those years before. As his life faded in Kenobi's arms, Maul asked one final question. He wanted to know whether the person Obi-Wan was protecting was the chosen one. When Kenobi confirmed it was true, Maul found a strange final piece in that answer, certain that this individual would one day avenge them both. Maul's story ended there on the sands of Tatooine, closing the loop on nearly 50 years of Star Wars history. From his birth on Dathomir in 54 BBY through his defeat on that same desert world around 2 BBY, Maul stands as one of the most tragic and enduring figures across the entire saga, Zabrak or otherwise. His story had finally come full circle, but the story of his species was far from finished. Dathomir was left with almost nothing after the Clone Wars. General Grievous had swept through the Nightsister Coven, and only a handful of witches made it out alive. Among the survivors was a young witch named Merrin, and she took on a role nobody had prepared her for. She became the guardian of the remaining Night Brother tribes, carrying forward whatever pieces of the Coven's traditions and dark magic had managed to survive. Years later, Merrin's path crossed with a Jedi Padawan named Cal Kestis, who arrived on Dathomir exploring the planet's ancient ruins and the legacy of the Zepho Force cult. Merrin became a key ally during that journey, one of the few named Nightsisters to carry any real presence into the galaxy after the fall of the Republic. Dathomir had been nearly wiped clean, but it had not been silenced entirely. Across the wider galaxy, change was finally coming for the rest of the species too. The Empire fell at the Battle of Endor in 4 ABY, and in the aftermath, something happened that had never truly happened before. The Zabraks, scattered across colonies for thousands of years, finally united as one people. They formally joined the fledgling New Republic, and they carried a vow with them into that new government. Never again would they submit to the kind of oppression they had endured under Imperial rule. In Legends continuity, Dathomir kept finding new ways to stay tangled up in galactic events even after the Empire's collapse. Nightsisters on the planet briefly captured General Han Solo, attempting to trade him to an Imperial warlord named Zinj in exchange for a way off the planet. Zinj had no intention of honoring that deal. He betrayed the Nightsisters instead, and the clan was nearly destroyed in the process. It was not the last time the Coven would gamble on the wrong ally either. By 23 ABY, the surviving Nightsisters under new leadership had aligned themselves with the Second Imperium. a fanatical Imperial remnant faction, proving once again that this coven would side with whichever dark side power gave them the best shot at survival. The wider Zabrak species kept showing up in galactic history long after that, too. Deep into the Legacy era, a Zabrak Jedi Master named Wolf Sazin served during the Sith Imperial War and the Second Imperial Civil War against Darth Krayt's reconstituted Galactic Empire. He trained both Cole Skywalker and his son Cade Skywalker before falling in the fighting himself more than a century after the Battle of Yavin, and still carrying the same warrior discipline that had defined this species since its earliest days on Iridonia. From the Old Republic all the way through that far future Legacy timeline, Zabraks never stopped appearing as Jedi, Sith, bounty hunters, and independent warriors scattered across every corner of the galaxy. No single government ever earned their full loyalty. That was never who they were. What defined them instead was a flat refusal to be controlled by anyone at all. The Nightsisters carried that same defiance forward in their own way. Their dark side traditions never fully disappeared, and eventually they resurfaced somewhere nobody expected, in live action, through a character named Morgan Elsbeth. That thread pulled even further when Ahsoka Tano herself was confirmed to be a Nightsister, with ties reaching all the way back to the extragalactic Great Mothers of Peridea. A tradition that started with a single exiled Jedi on a forgotten planet had somehow reached across galaxies and across generations, still shaping the story centuries after Alia ever set foot on Dathomir. Zabrak identity always came back to the same handful of things no matter the era. Facial tattoos that marked where someone came from and who their family was. Horns that signaled a passage into adulthood. A body built for endurance, capable of pushing through pain that would stop most other species cold. Those markers stayed consistent, whether a Zabrak wore Jedi robes, Sith black, bounty hunter armor, or Mandalorian beskar. The uniform changed depending on the era. The person underneath it rarely did. And this species is still writing new chapters. Maul remains the most infamous name to ever come out of Dathomir or Iridonia, and his story keeps finding new corners of the galaxy to reach into, decades after his very first appearance. Devon Izara is only just beginning her own path down the same dark road he walked. A new chapter built on the same pattern of loss, turning into loyalty that has followed Maul his entire life. Wherever that story goes next, it will keep pulling new names into a legacy that stretches back over 5,000 years. That legacy was never really about one Sith Lord, and it was never really about one witch coven either. It was about an entire species that refused to be shaped entirely by anyone else's hands. Iridonian mercenaries armed the ancient Sith Empire on their own terms. Bao-Dur's engineering ended a war that scarred him for the rest of his life, and he spent his remaining years trying to build instead of destroy. Mother Talzin's Nightsisters, born out of exile and forbidden magic, ended up raising the very apprentice who would one day turn against Sidious's own rule of two. Even within one single family, this species produced both its most feared Sith Lord and two Jedi Masters, who gave everything defending the very order that Sith Lord tried to help tear apart. No empire, no Sith order, and no single war across 5,000 years of galactic history ever managed to fully break this species. Every time something tried to stamp out Zabrak independence, from ancient Sith contracts to imperial garrisons, the horns kept showing up somewhere else in the galaxy, refusing to bow, refusing to disappear, and refusing to let anyone else decide what came next for them.